Okay, let's finish up today some work in management ethics. And if you'll pull out your business ethics and action texts, we will get started with that. And I want to talk especially about, so we're in page 248. I want to talk especially about a couple of issues in management ethics and in particular in HR ethics, human resources. Okay, so that's where we're focusing today. We're going to talk about two issues. One of them, I suppose, somewhat controversial, but one of them quite controversial, and I think we'll have a good civil discussion today. Okay, the first issue that I want to focus on is compensation for unskilled workers, and especially the topic of the minimum wage. Okay, so keep your thumb in the chapter on page 248, and I hope you were able to read the account of Gap, the clothing company, the big retail clothing company, on page 249. This is a topic that we've covered a bit before, the topic of child labor, and it's very typical for apparel companies to go around the world and to find the cheapest location where they can make their products. And that includes especially workers who are not going to cause trouble, not going to agitate for better working conditions, not going to unionize so that management will be forced to pay them more. And in this case, Gap got busted for their use of child labor. And it's not hard to see why they used child labor. It was very much just because they figured, I'm sure, the execs thought that using children would mean using workers who could be more easily exploited. But it raises certain questions about how do we treat, what's the best way to compensate workers who don't have many skills and who kind of come in at the bottom of the barrel when it comes to the labor force. And I want to offer a couple of different examples here. Okay, does anybody know off the top of your head what the minimum wage is in Texas? $7.25, I think. Yeah, I believe that's right. Okay, so Texas, the minimum wage is $7.25. And can anyone take a guess at what the minimum wage is in California? Anybody know? Ben, do you know? Yeah, 15. I believe it is 15, yeah. Very good, thank you. Okay, my wife and I were in Bolivia a couple of summers ago. She grew up as a missionary kid in South America and Bolivia, and so she was showing me all her old haunts. And in Bolivia, the minimum wage is 0. Okay, there is no minimum wage. All right. So here we have 3 different examples of very different approaches to the minimum wage topic and the issue of how to compensate workers at the lower end of the spectrum. What's fair compensation for them? And I want to suggest that there are advantages and disadvantages of each of these different approaches. So let's think a little bit first about the case of California. Okay, so we're going to use California as our case example, and we're going to talk about pros of having a $15 minimum wage and cons of having a $15 minimum wage. So without a doubt, I'll get us started. One pro is the workers who would otherwise be more easily exploitable cannot be exploited because the state requires companies to pay them a certain amount. Okay, and maybe that's factory workers who don't have many skills. I'm sorry, my computer just shut the camera down. There we are. Okay. All right, I restarted it. Okay, factory workers who don't have many skills. It includes fast food workers, apparel workers, lots of people who don't have many skills. It benefits a certain number of unskilled workers. You guys let me know if you have trouble seeing some of these points behind the podium. Okay, it benefits unskilled workers, at least a certain number of them. What are some other pros and cons? Let's brainstorm together. think about this together. Who is not benefited by California's $15 minimum wage law?
Business owners?
What's that? A little louder?
Business owners?
Business owners, okay? It doesn't help, especially small business owners, okay, who, I'll just put down here small business owners, but I suppose we could imagine some larger business owners who would fall into these categories too. Business owners who maybe don't have a whole lot of profits to be able to increase the wages of a certain number among their workforce, who they might not otherwise be paying $15 an hour, and who as a result are substantially pinched because their margins have to shrink. Okay, what do you guys think business owners in that sort of a circumstance would do when faced with a $15 minimum wage law? What are they likely to do if they are having trouble making payroll at that point?
Cut costs elsewhere?
Yeah, so they're going to cut a number of employees, right? Won't they? Yeah, Rainer?
Like either cut or make higher requirements for people looking for a job.
Yeah, okay. So one con is it leads to layoffs and also stricter hiring. Now, most of those businesses are still going to need to get the job done. So a lot of them will turn to automation, okay? Or a lot of them might just impose larger work requirements upon the existing workforce that they have hired. Okay, so it's not good then for those who do get laid off and also for those who are on the outside. It's great if you're on the inside as someone who has a job, but not necessarily so good if you are on the outside because it's a lot harder to get hired in a situation where minimum wage laws are that high. Okay, we've listed some cons. What are some other pros? I'll just add one. It just introduces a spirit of fairness, I think. Often in the business world, we see asymmetric power advantages, where employers who have asymmetric power advantages use whatever methods that they can to negotiate weak and unskilled or uneducated workers down to the minimal possible amount in terms of compensation. And it's good in such circumstances just to introduce a spirit of fairness, which often is lacking in a pure market situation. So when the government introduces regulations, external non-market forces intervene in the wages of the employees, and sometimes it can introduce good things like equality or fairness. One other thing I want to get up here, it's not necessarily good for those workers who are on the other side of the company. Okay, people who maybe are making a lot more than this normally might not make more than that normally because the business has to spread things around now because the minimum wage law is so high. That's another thing to think about. Are there any other pros or cons we could list here?
Isn't it raise the cost of living for basically everybody else there?
Great comment. Yeah. Terrific. Yeah. So maybe there's a certain inflation in consumer discretionaries. If you look at the cost of living in California, and I doubt if it's all attributable, of course, to the higher minimum wage laws. It's mostly attributable, I think, to the fact that everyone wants to live near the coast in perfect climate. But if you look at the cost of living there, it's extraordinary. It's incredibly high, much, much higher than it is here in Houston. Housing is way higher. The price of gas is way, way higher. When I last visited California about a year and a half ago, the price of gas was about 1.7 or 1.8 times as high as it is here in Houston. Okay, and I'm sure that there are other inflation indexes that we could point to. That's because people are getting a higher minimum wage. Now let's look at the opposite end of the spectrum. Just think about it real quickly. In Bolivia, no minimum wage. From the cons that we've listed, you might think, well, maybe it's not good to have a minimum wage. You might even go in that direction. But if you look at Bolivia, it's kind of the flip side of this. The business owners are benefited, but those who are not benefited are all sorts of unskilled workers who get their wages negotiated down to incredibly small amounts. The factory workers in Santa Cruz and Cochabamba, where I visited, I didn't go in any factories, but I'm sure if I did a little bit of research, I could very quickly find factories where the workers are making less than 40 cents an hour. Okay, it's not very hard to find that sort of thing in a country like that. And I know that the cost of living is much lower there, but even on a cost of living adjusted basis, those unskilled workers are making a lot less than the unskilled counterparts are here in the United States. So if you look at the opposite end of the spectrum in Bolivia, the people who don't get benefited at all are the poor who are at the bottom end of the employment ladder. So we have here three options, and presumably Texas is somewhere in the middle, and so has some of the benefits here of California, some of the drawbacks as well. Of these three, which would you guys prefer to live under? Just say Texas, it's in the middle. It has the best of all possible worlds. I'm totally joking, but it probably depends on who you are. Okay, some people are definitely benefited more by this. And others are definitely benefited more by this. The large business owners, for instance, are probably benefited more by that in Bolivia. So it all depends on who you are. I was reading an interesting article not too long ago that was a commentary on the fast food industry, and especially on the way that many workers, an extraordinarily high percentage of workers at McDonald's, that was the company that was being highlighted by the article, are actually on some form of government assistance, welfare especially, the welfare program. And by many, I mean more than a quarter of the workers. And I was just blown away by that. It turns out that taxpayers are heavily subsidizing McDonald's business model, because McDonald's is not apparently paying their workers enough for those workers to be able to have a decent lifestyle. So certainly workers at McDonald's would be benefited more by a situation like California has offered, rather than definitely than one here, and maybe even than one that Texas offers as well. Are there any last thoughts on the topic of minimum wage, pros and cons from a moral point of view? Yes, Dr. Hamadi.
I have a question about that last thing.
Oh, yes.
Just curious. So, all right, is it possible that the McDonald's employee in California and Texas has the exact same lifestyle? It's just under California, it's all being paid by their living wage.
Mm-hmm.
And in Texas, it's a combination of the low minimum wage plus government services. So really what's happening is they're the same. It's just the taxpayer should prefer California because they're not paying for, like I don't eat at McDonald's. I don't want to pay for the McDonald's workers, right? You know, but if I am in Texas because I'm paying my taxes, then shouldn't I want the $15 minimum wage so that they get off of my?
So
I'm not paying for them anymore?
I'd have to see the stats for sure to know exactly with precision, but my intuition is with you on that. I think you're probably saying it more precisely than I was a minute ago. For sure, if you're a taxpayer, given the dynamics of you having to subsidize the McDonald's workers in a situation like that, you should probably, for that reason at least, prefer this, because it offloads the use of the services upon the customers and not upon the whole of the society, which seems to be, I'm generally for solutions that require the people who are using the service to pay for the service. I'm actually in favor of you guys are going to get blown away by this, I'm in favor of a for-hire fire department. You only get to use the services of the fire department if you pay your monthly dues. It would be much more efficient than the system we have, actually, where the fire department is paid for by the collective. But it would enable those who actually want fire services to be able to have them, and then, you know, those who don't want fire services don't have to pay for it, but they run the risk of potentially getting their house burned down or something. I know that such things exist, and I read a case where the fire department, in a place where such a thing existed, showed up and protected the houses around the house that hadn't paid its dues, but let the house burn down. At the same time, though, there's greater efficiency in that kind of an arrangement, because if you want to run the risk, you don't have to pay for the service. And it is a more market-based solution. Okay, but back to the matter at hand. I'm generally in favor, Dr. Hamadi, of circumstances where those who use the product are the ones who actually pay for it rather than the collective subsidizing the product and subsidizing the business model of the company that provides the product. So from the point of view of the general taxpayer, at least on that particular metric, this might be better. I do agree with you. Okay, terrific.